Hi everybody, and welcome to Tuesday and welcome to our lean-in session. I'm Michael Linke, General Manager here at the Institute of Architects, and it's great to have you with me at this lean-in session. Thanks for joining me. Today's session has been made possible by Momentum Energy. They're a very proud supporter of the Institute's Climate Action and Sustainability Task Force. I'm very thrilled today to be joined by prominent energy expert, inventor and White House advisor Saul Griffith for a very special session. And Saul's going to discuss the future of home energy in Australia. So in this lean-in session, Saul is going to share how architects can help clients cut emissions while saving homes money and what the future really means for infrastructure and for saving bills, especially as we see inflation escalating quite rapidly and just the general cost of living. Now, the session is being recorded and of course will be available on the Institute's website and on our YouTube channel later on as well for you to watch at a later stage. But don't forget that the chat box is open. So if you do have any questions for Saul, pop your questions in the chat box and I'll go through them with him at the end of his session. A little bit about Saul. Saul Griffith is, of course, an engineer and an inventor. He's a founder, he's a chief scientist at other lab. He's an independent research and development guru. He helps government agencies and, like I said, he's a White House advisor. He works with Fortune 500 companies to understand their energy infrastructure and their deep decarbonisation. He's been a principal investigator and a project lead on federally funded research projects for organisations like NASA and the Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency and the United States Special Operations Command, SOCOM. He was, of course, awarded the MacArthur's Genius Grant in 2007, and he completed his PhD at Massachusetts Institute of Tech in 2004. He is also a very proud Australian, and it's great to have someone so prominent on the global stage representing our wonderful country. He is, apart from, of course, being a father and a chief scientist and an all-round lovely chap, he's also an incredible author, and he's recently written an incredible book called The Big Switch, and I'll get Saul to talk about that a little bit more. But that's it really from me. Saul Griffith joins us on the program now. Saul, welcome to our lean-in. Great to have you with us.
Thank you enormously. I've really got to find who puts this White House advisor stuff on the internet, because it's not considered polite to say you're a White House advisor. So I've got to track that down. Although I am proud to say you might hear that Biden announced a couple of executive announcements today to use the Wartime Production Act to make heat pumps for Europe and American buildings to limit the need for Russian gas and to increase solar production in the US. So as not a White House advisor, I'm very proud of what they're doing to get the job done. Michael, with that, are you asking me to take it away?
Yes, yeah, feel free,
Okay,
just take it away.
great.
It's a very informal session. So yeah, like I said, if any of our viewers have got questions, just pop them in that chat box below. I'll open that up in a second. But yeah, fire away, Saul, it's all yours, mate.
All right, terrific. As it's informal, I can then say I literally, if you look at my dating history, love architects. They feature prominently. I love what you do. I grew up an architect, built house. I just finished a architect designed house in San Francisco that's 100% zero emission, which was a fun, expensive, and painful exercise all at once. Today, I'm going to talk about my efforts rewiring Australia, but pretty specifically focused on the household and the opportunities there. I'm going to fly through that. Happy to take questions around the general big picture for Australia. But as someone who's thought about buildings and the built environment specifically, happy to, at the end, go as deep or as long as you want on any built environment topics. With that, I'm going to try sharing my screen. Hopefully everyone's seeing a big Rewiring Australia plug.
Yep, perfect, Saul.
Thank you. So Rewiring Australia is an organization I started last year in the footprint of Rewiring America, which is an organization I started with a friend in America in 2019, both of them with the remit to talk about decarbonisation and electrification of the demand side. So there's a supply and a demand side of energy. Climate policy traditionally was all about supply. Where are we going to get our oil from, our coal, and our electricity from? And that's to underrepresent the importance of electrifying and decarbonising the demand side is where we use it. It's our cars, it's our homes, it's our small businesses. Really, we're talking about an abundance agenda for Australia, which is how do we eliminate all of our climate emissions, create jobs in communities, revitalize community economics, and save money for households. I truly believe all those things are possible. I'm going to get to that, but I'm going to step back and put Australian emissions and Australian domestic emissions into the IPCC context. And then it'll give you a sense of urgency that hopefully as practicing architects you can unleash on the world. This is a bit of a complicated slide, but I think it's important. This is how Australia has to submit its emissions to the IPCC. I've rearranged them for all of Australia's emissions. Those below the dotted line they don't actually count as our emissions. This is when we sell our coal or our gas overseas to be burned elsewhere. Our emissions that do count at the IPCC are above the dotted line, and we can break those into two things. Domestic emissions, which are things that support the domestic economy, so our day-to-day living, our driving, etc. And then things that are our trade emissions. So this is the use of energy in Australia, where the emission occurs in Australia, but actually it's supporting an export industry. For example, this little red one here is fuel combustion in our mines and on our freight railways to get coal out of the ground on a train to port to send somewhere else to be burned somewhere else. Or agriculture here. These are methane emissions from our cows burping and farting here, even though 60% of our beef and sheep is destined for export. Keep those things in your mind. Now we're going to talk about emissions and everyday experience. This is how the IPCC thinks about what's called emissions trajectories. So here we are over here at 2020, where my cursor is, 40 billion tons a year of CO2 going into the atmosphere. We now need to travel down one of these blue paths in terms of our emissions to hit a 1.5 to 2 degree target of warming by the end of this century. That's very aggressive. P1 and P2, P3, P4, these are what are called representative scenarios. They run thousands of models. These are just 4 of them. P1 and P2 go just a little bit below the zero line here, so only a small amount of negative emissions required to balance the budget. They might be reasonable. P3 and P4 require us to bury as much carbon dioxide underground in the future as we currently pull out of the ground in all of our fossil fuel industries today. So really, we need to go more towards P1 or P2, realistically. That means fast and early emission reductions are vital. This big, thick line is the origin of the headlines you've heard, 50% reductions or more by 2030. So there's 2030, and there's 20 gigatons, which is half of 40. So that's where that headline comes from. We've got to be super steep. How do we put your community in context of that? Well, a little bit was a hint that I showed you before with those green, orange, and red slides on our emissions. So here in Australia, actually most around the world, it's fairly similar. End use electrification. So that means electrifying our houses, our household heating and heating systems, and our vehicles, and deploying renewables or maybe even nuclear power. Those are technologies that you can buy off the shelf today, electrify the demand side, renewables on the supply side, and we can actually eliminate the great majority of the world's emissions. The harder to abate sectors, air travel, beef, agriculture, refrigerant, steel, aluminium, cement. You can hear a lot of people make a lot of headlines about these and make them sound hard. None of them really can happen today. We don't have ready to go technology. So we really should be focusing on these things we can do now in green. So we buy ourselves enough time. I think everyone knows roughly how to get there on these harder sectors. They just need time to scale. And then red, we need to go negative emissions later. Given that, what we know how to do today happens in your community. And so we can really say we've got about 20 years to get our communities to zero emissions to make it all work out. And because you're architects, many of you think about the mechanical systems in homes. Let's put that emission reduction trajectory in the context of the machines that we put in homes. Water heaters last about 10 years, kitchen appliances about 12, space heaters about 15 years, cars about 20. These curves here are what happens if we stop buying any new ones of those basically tomorrow. And so we only ever install an electric water heater in Australia after tomorrow. The emission reduction according to water heaters will follow that blue curve. For space heaters, that green curve. For cars, that purple curve. So if tomorrow you could only buy an electric heat pump for a water heater or a space heater, you could only buy an electric vehicle, then we would be staying on this community target. That is difficult and it sounds hard, but I think to put it in perspective, these few slides might help you. This was, someone watched me give this talk and they gave me this interesting feedback that they had pledged net zero as a family by 2025. And I love this idea. Buy solar now, finance, because solar already works economically in Australia, and do that in 2022. That would give them a couple of years of saving money such that they could afford to electrify the stove and the water heater over the next couple of years. That would buy them time. So by 2024, the batteries are cheaper. So then they get a household battery. Then in 2025, that's when they think the electric vehicle they want will occur. And that'll get them nearly all the way to zero, except for a few things like banking and composting. That is really to say this line of thinking turns 50 years of environmentalism on its head. It used to be that we would reduce and reuse and recycle our way to success on any environmental problem. And that gave us, recycle your paper cup and carry a stainless steel water bottle. But really, the great majority of emissions of any real individual are a small number of machines that they make once every 10 years. Buying a car, choosing to buy an electric bicycle, getting rooftop solar, purchasing green electricity from their utility or distributor, water heater, cooking, house battery. And you can see, so our emission reductions are sort of this step function related to the infrastructure in your life. Now, if you get every household to sort of follow this plan, we can actually collectively get our communities to zero emissions on the time frame required for a 1.5 degree world. So that's what success looks like translated to the real machines in real people's lives and homes. Quite astonishingly, 42% of the domestic emissions in Australia, the emissions in our domestic economy, come from these decisions we've just mentioned around the kitchen table. What fuels your car? What heats your home? Where does your electricity come from? How are your fuels made? That actually goes to 65% of your emissions if you include small businesses, which basically have the same types of loads. They have cars, they have water heaters and space heaters. This is how we do it today. Here's the average Australian household, bigger than it needs to be maybe. We fuel all of our vehicles and all of our toys from petrol or diesel. We run a lot of our cooking and a lot of our heating systems, including pools and spas, from natural gas. And we purchase most of our electricity in New South Wales, for example, 3/4 is from coal. It averages across the nation about 65% from coal, more than 3/4 from fossil fuels, as you can see here. But remember, achieving zero is pretty simple. Electrify the demand side machines and supply that with clean electricity. We can start to think in a quite cartoon sense of what we have to do to our building stock. There's 1.8 vehicles in the average driveway. Electrify them, electrify the water heater, electrify the space heater, electrify the kitchen, add solar, add a battery, upgrade the fuse box if necessary to accommodate all of that, and then provide solar, wind, and hydroelectricity as the additional electricity to the rooftop and community to get to zero. Now, the astonishing thing about this electrification is it's going to cut the energy use by more than half for Australia, for the average Australian household, without shrinking our cars, without shrinking our houses, without really doing any traditional efficiency measures. It'll also improve our health, our quality of life, and lower the energy bills. So you're thinking that's pretty extraordinary. Here's to give you a picture of that. On the left, this is when I'm talking in America, this is an F-150. In Australia, it's either a Toyota Hilux or a Ford Ranger, running on petrol or diesel. about 80% of that energy is lost as waste heat. That's why the engine block gets hot, the exhaust pipe's hot. If that were an electric Rivian or an electric F-150 by Ford, which is basically the Ranger, it actually uses less than 2/3 less energy, and nearly all of it goes into moving you instead of being waste heat compared to the vehicles. So this is the efficiency we were always looking for on vehicles. Similarly true with space water heaters. So this is normal gas water heater on the left, about 90% efficient historically, with 50 years of Energy Star appliances. We've made them about 95% efficient, just a tiny bit less. But as many of you know, with a heat pump, especially in Australia's mild climate, it'll use less than 1/3 the amount of energy in the form of electricity to produce the same amount of heat as the natural gas equivalent. We get that same efficiency win using a mini split or a heat pump compared to natural gas for heating our buildings. So about 1/3 of the energy, and even for our cooking. The blue flame that you've been sold for years as perfect and clean is not really clean. It's actually, you know, if we called it methane instead of natural gas, it might have been harder to sell it to you. Only about 1/3 of the energy in that gas, or a half, gets used to heat the kettle or the frying pan on top, whereas with modern electric induction, they're about twice as efficient. So half of the energy for the same amount of cooking as gas. Then the biggest saving of all in Australia, of course, is how we make our electricity. Over here on the left, coal and gas. In Australia, as much as 70% of the energy in our coal and gas is lost as waste heat. So these big white clouds you see aren't actually smoke, it's steam from the cooling coming off these machines, eliminating that waste heat. When we generate our electricity with solar or wind instead, we eliminate all of that waste heat, and you get another big win. This tells that whole story in terms of an Australian household. So on the left is what happens in your average Australian household today. They use 102 kilowatt hours of energy of all types every day. About 13 kilowatts is electricity, the little blue one at the bottom. About 20 kilowatts is the orange. That's the waste heat generated by those plants making that electricity. The purple here is natural gas. The darker purple is propane. The little green bit is the remaining number of homes that in Tasmania that use wood for wood heating. And then the giant portion here, the majority of the energy used in Australian households is petrol in light grey and diesel in dark grey. But remember, over here on the right, we're going to electrify all the machines, and that'll mean our 102 kilowatt hours a day goes to about 37 kilowatt hours a day. So energy use goes down by more than half, even though electricity use goes up almost 300%. Now, that's a good news story, tons less energy, but how does it work out economically? And here's the story. Traditional Australian or average Australian house today, this is from the ABS Household Expenditure Survey, spends about $80,000 a year after taxes. About $5,000 a year of that is on energy. That's about $2,700 on petrol and diesel, $1,700 or $1,800 on electricity, and $700 on gas a year. That's that average. This shows you how it affects different households. So these are the quintiles, or 20% of each of the income brackets for households. The richest 20% of households use 4 or 5% of their household expenditure goes on fuels and energy. For the poorest 20% of households, excuse me, still coughing from COVID, 8 to 10%, and actually for the poorest 10% of households, it can be 10 to 20% of their weekly expenditure going on energy, and that's very difficult for those households. But there is very good news. Some of you will remember Moore's law. Moore's law was the statement that computers would get twice as fast and twice as cheap every time we doubled the number of them that we made. Before it was known as Moore's law, it was known as Ford's law for the falling price of driving cars every time we double the number of cars we made. And before that, it was known as Wright's law, the falling price of flying as we doubled the number of aircraft. What this chart says is that every time we double the number of solar created globally, they get 22% cheaper. We know that for solar, it's about 22%, wind 14%, batteries 20%, EVs 21%. We also know to get to zero emissions globally in the next 2 decades, we need 10 to 20 times as much of this stuff. And so that you can now make the extraordinary statement that the critical technologies we need for this zero emission transition are all going to fall in price by more than half, just by virtue of producing what we need to get to zero emissions. It's those cost trends that I've tried to capture in this graph. Sorry if I'm going too fast through all of this, but hopefully we can fix it in question time. This is the good news story for the Australian household. Over here on the left, average Australian household in 2021, $5,200 a year in energy expenditures. In 2022, you can see that's gone up. This you could call the Putin petrol price. So it's now about $7,000 a year because of the rising price of gas and petrol. Excuse me. Now, if you remember, I told you there's only a small number of things. So that you need to buy to fix this. So this gray bar is actually what it would cost you if you went out in 2022 and you financed two new electric vehicles, a new electric heat pump, water heater, a new electric kitchen, all of the pieces. The pink amount at the bottom is how much you'd pay in the electricity from the grid. The gray component finances the solar, the battery, and all of the other components. And as you can see, which would probably feel about right to many of you, the electric cars are still a little bit too expensive. The electric conversions of the space heat in the kitchen may still be a little expensive. But we actually know that because of those cost trends, probably 2024 or 2025 is the economic break-even point for Australian households, where financing these things will lead to significant energy savings. And you can actually project out now to about 2030. This uses the economic numbers from Bloomberg New Energy Finance and from Lazard's, etc. So these are fairly conservative economic assessments, but by 2030, the average Australian household could be saving as much as $3,000 to $5,000 a year on their cost of living. As a country, this is kind of extraordinary. For $12 billion of investment early this decade in terms of helping people deal with that upfront cost, Australia could go through the 0 point and start saving up to $40 billion a year on our households, which is quite an extraordinary thing we could do as a country. So this now looks like a good investment opportunity for the country. Just to do it in cartoons, why is it actually going to save you money? This was actually at $1.48 a litre, this price, but driving your petrol Ford Ranger 1 kilometre will cost you actually about 20 cents now. Whereas if you were driving the electric Rivian equivalent off Australian rooftop solar, as it is installs at $1 a watt, it'll cost you about 1 cent per kilometre. So you can imagine how much money you're saving if you're saving more than 10 cents every kilometre you drive. That's also true for showers. If we're running an electric heat pump off your solar, it'll cost you 6 cents. If you're running, this is for an 8-minute shower, 66 cents run on gas, hot water heater, just to put you in perspective. Even a cup of tea is a much cheaper proposition at this point, going all electric. Now, just to give everyone a flavor. So it's a good news story for the household, but how does it look for a suburb? Because what we're trying to do really is get everyone there. So I think it's interesting to think about the suburb. I'm living in Austinmere. It's about 50 minutes south of Sydney. Turns out it's almost exactly average by Australian suburb standards. It's got 1,000 households in it. It's got 1,300 children, 700 families, 2,500 people. About 80% of the homes are standalone. The other 20% are apartments and unit blocks. We're in an extremely typical postcode, 2515. around 11,000 people, 3,000 families, 4,500 buildings, 2.7 people in each household. Again, these are pretty much exactly average Australian numbers. Currently, we get all of our electricity from Wombara Zone Substation, which it turns out again is an extremely average zone substation. You're architects, you probably don't care about zone substations as much as I do. You probably think of them as those architectural nightmares that look like this thing down here in the bottom right hand corner that you see beside the freeway or near a railway station in your suburb. That Wombara Zone Substation serves every household in our area, mostly with electricity from the grid. And the substation goes to utility poles or telegraph poles. You probably recognize them. You'll probably now be familiar that a few of them have a little wart on them. That's called a distribution transformer. This transformer sends high voltage to the low voltage transformer on the wires that then takes electricity to the houses. Again, ours is average. There's about 4 to 5 strings, about 1,000 households on each string in our suburb. Here's the amount of electricity Wombara uses today to provide all of those 4,500 houses. About 2 megawatts in summer, about 4 megawatts in winter. That's the black line is the daily average. The gray is the variation. It's pretty cool. You can see really hot day here in December, another really hot day here in February, and you can see the air conditioner load increase the electricity there and there. Really cold day here in August, another one in September. You can see the heating loads go up. So you can actually really see the effects of weather on these things. You'll remember, however, that we have this chart from earlier. Energy goes down, electricity use goes up. What does that mean? That means this. So black is today, yellow dotted line is what happens if we electrify all the heating systems, orange is if we electrify one of the 1.8 cars, and red is if we electrify every single car in the suburb. So this is what we would like postcode 2515 to look like in 2040. And we need 7 or 8 megawatts in the winter now and about 6 megawatts in the summer to provide all of that. You might say that sounds like a lot. That's a big increase, 250%. But the Australian experience is that rooftop solar is the cheapest electricity ever for Australians. After financing, it's 4 or 5 cents, maybe 5 or 6 cents per kilowatt hour, whereas from the grid, it's coming in 25 cents a kilowatt hour. The good news is this. This is work done by the University of New South Wales, Australian Photovoltaics Institute. You can see up here, or maybe you can't, but you should be able to. This is 2515. So this is the estimate for what would happen if every house that was eligible had a reasonable sized solar installation on it. And our postcode could produce 74 gigawatt hours a year, and we only need 55 gigawatt hours a year to meet the total load if we electrify everything. So, in sort of an extraordinary way, Austinmere, which is a very typical suburb, not a high density city suburb, not a low density suburb, sort of in the middle, could meet all of its demand. That's not true year round because we produce twice as much sun in the winter as we do in the summer as we do in the winter. But it means if 100% of us had rooftop solar, we'd produce more energy than we need for 9 months of the year, and we'd be just short a little bit in the winter months. That is an opportunity to say what we could really do for Australian communities in terms of renewal. So I'm just going to finish with sort of what I think is the incredible economic opportunity for Australia that actually puts jobs and money back into our communities in an interesting way. Another way of expressing what happens with a household today is that the average household in our postcode spends $3,400 a year on petrol and diesel. That leaves the community pretty much immediately, creating half a job at the local service station, whereas that job, it's not really a fossil fuel job. It's selling, corn syrup, sugar, and tobacco. It's a very little job creation. Quite similar with natural gas. And then we do spend about $1,000 on electricity from the grid. But with a small amount of solar that we do today, we're spending a little bit of money in labor and in savings from that solar in our community. What could we be doing in 2030? Saving that $4,000 or nearly $4,000 on petrol and diesel and generating it off our own rooftops and in our community, saving all of that money on our natural gas. We'd still spend $1,000 on electricity from the grid, but it would be wind and solar. And we'd be saving for every household about $5,300 per year and spending about $5,600 a year in the community, a bunch of that on labor up here. And so that's a pretty good news story. How does it look for the whole postcode? Today we spend $15 million on fossil fuel. Well, actually it's on oil, and we spend $4 million on grid electricity. What we could be doing in 2030 instead is we'll still spend that $4 million on grid electricity, but we'll spend $1.4 million a year on local electrification labor. That's contractors and tradies installing these electric appliances, including the solar. That'll create 25 jobs, new jobs, and we would be saving about $21 million a year in the community. We know that 55% of household expenditures are spent within the local community. So if that $21 million was spent as it probably would be from savings, that would also create 400 jobs in the community. And you can just, another way to think about it is, if a single postcode with 5,000 households in it was spending $20 million every year, you run out of RSL clubs and surf life-saving clubs and football fields and classrooms that you can build with that money after a few years, because you've already gold-plated the community. So this is an incredible opportunity to move economics and reorient it towards communities within Australia. So I'll stop there, having not said enough on things that concern architects, so that we save a bunch of time to go into detail on all the things that you care about.
Thank you, Saul. That's great. I've got a number of questions that have come in privately, and I'm just going through them as well. Let's start. I mean, obviously, we're fresh out of a federal election, and we've seen some shock results. We've seen a huge amount of sentiment, probably more so than we've seen in recent elections over the past, 10, 12, 20 years, where we've seen Australians really have a very strong say on matters that really have been very important to them. Climate action, especially, we've seen candidates who have campaigned very much on climate action win. Now, I mean, you're beloved, I don't know if that's the right word, but you're beloved in the US, and you advise a huge amount of federal US government bodies on climate change and electrification. Why not here? What's the barrier? Or are you working with government? That was one question that came in. Why are you so famous effectively in the US, but not so well known in your home country?
I have abandoned the US as it abandoned me.
Right.
America failed at the war on drugs, failed in the war in Afghanistan, failed in the war in Iraq, failed on the war on gun violence, but it succeeded in the war against parenting. So we, my wife and I, decided in 2020 to move here. That was about half of the story. The other half of the reason was watching Biden come in and then working with the White House. I was very excited on day one because they announced 50% emission reductions by 2030. But it was apparent after about 3 months that they were going to be challenged by not having enough seats in the Senate and having some Democrats that weren't going to play perfectly with them, such as Joe Manchin. And that it became apparent that America was not going to be as ambitious on climate as we would like. Mm. And while doing all of the similar studies that I just showed you in cartoon form for Australia, we did those studies for the US. It became apparent to me that Australia gets to go first. And so in a theory of change sense, I realized that if you could demonstrate to America how to get to zero emissions while improving people's lives and saving them money, you could actually make America more ambitious on climate change. And the place to do that wasn't California, it's Australia. And the underlying reason is through a little bit of good luck and through a little bit of forward thinking, we literally optimize the building codes, the permitting and the inspection components of rooftop solar so that the cost of installing 1 watt of solar in Australia is under $1, and in the US it's more than $3.20. That's why we have the cheapest electricity in the world on our rooftops. So
Right.
it was literally zoning and building codes and things that concern architects that are the difference between that rooftop solar miracle in Australia and the US. And because of that, 25 or 30% of Australian households have rooftop solar, and they've had a positive experience of climate solutions. And I think we're set up to go faster. So sort of I'm optimistic for Australia and now trying to work that agenda here. Another way of saying it is if you could have building heating policy from the Netherlands, which is no more gas heating after 2025. If you could have electric vehicle policy from Norway or California, and you could have Australian rooftop solar policy, if those 3 things could happen in one country, and especially if that country was Australia, that's what makes all of those economics that I just showed you come true. So I'm now here to advocate for the policy to do that. And I actually saw the election about 2 things. It was about climate, but it was also about communities, as evidenced by community-oriented independence.
Yep.
And in some respects, that's why the end of the chat I just showed you was like, if we're thinking about this as communities and we're thinking about climate as communities, there's a lot to win here.
Well, we're very fortunate to have you back. It's great. America's loss is our gain for sure. A couple of other texts have come through. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was incredibly simple. My kids would really love this. It was so easy to understand. One of the most simple and straightforward presentations. If you like Saul's presentation, I'm going to talk more about his book, The Big Switch, later. It is in a very similar vein, very, very easy and digestible to read at a casual rate. Keep the questions coming into the chat. I'm going to go to some of the questions, and this is from Ran. Ran asks, look, Saul, do the energy calculations for space heating and cooling allow for improved insulation of houses? Talking about both new builds as well as retrofit, alterations and additions and those sort of things. Let's start with that question.
Oh, I'm going to horrify everyone.
We like a little bit of we do like a little bit of scandal. So yeah, feel free to fire away with your response on that.
My numbers assume that Australians are going to continue to build houses as shittily for the next 20 years as they have for the last 100. So I didn't build in any extra insulation, any double glazing, anything in the models for these economics. I don't know, it's about 100,000 new homes a year we build in Australia. We've got about 10 million households. On the 20 years that matter for climate change, only 10 to 20% of our building stock is going to be new build. That's the reasoning I use for like, let's just discount all of that efficiency stuff and I'll do the numbers without the efficiency. That is because the only really economic time to build an efficient home is that when you're building it the first time. The retrofits are quite expensive, as many of you will be aware. I'm trying to, that we bought a house in Ostermeer that was built in 3 parts on weekends with spare parts from a Sydney construction site that they stole the parts from. It was like a traditional South Coast weekender. And it's horrific. We may as well tear this down to try and do anything that would make it efficient. So my theory is that most of the efficiency things should be done in building codes on our new build. We should try and squeeze in efficiency wherever we can, wherever it's cost effective, in the retrofits, particularly the big retrofits. But that actually Australia is so well positioned, our rooftops are so big, our sunshine is so good, squeezing the last few percentage points of efficiency out of the house isn't as important in an emissions or any other sense than just making sure that everything gets electrified.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Interestingly enough, and regretfully, the majority of new builds are done by, well, we've seen, some appearing on the news recently. I mean, the majority of new builds are done rapidly and as cheaply as possible. And I always think, as we probably all do, you get what you pay for. But, the more that architects can be involved in the design of energy efficient homes, the better. And we'll talk more about that in due course. Let's talk a little bit about solar panels. I've had two people, Ran again on the chat, talked about, has asked you the question, which is just in relation to solars. And he said, look, can you explain the details of why rooftop solar is so cheap? That's the first one. I've got another one that's come in privately, and it says, I have clients. An architect has sent me a message. Michael, I've got clients who are very, very keen to have solar, but are holding back because they have heard the actual development of solar panels is quite toxic in the production process. Can you comment on that? Let's start with the toxicity of the development of solar panels and in the creation of them. And then we'll talk about why the details of rooftop solar is so cheap as per your presentation.
In the grand scheme of things, the production of solar cells isn't that bad. Those same clients should not be allowed to own a cell phone or an iPad or a computer or a modern car. And so I think that is to say, we need to look in detail at everything in the modern world as we try to get towards zero. The toxic things in it are not that bad in the production of silicon in solar, because it doesn't have a lot of rare earth elements in it, but there are things like sulfur hexafluoride and hydrofluoric acid that are used in production. They're not wonderful things, but they're not necessarily the worst things in the world. Here's the way I think you should answer that question more sensibly. The average Australian today uses 6,000 kilograms of fossil fuels per year: oil, gas, coal. When they burn it, it becomes about 16 tons, 16,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide for each of us, which we dispose of clearly into the atmosphere. If I electrify your whole life, and just for argument's sake, half of it will be wind power, half of it will be solar power, and we'll store half of it in batteries, you'll need about 50 kilograms each per year, because wind turbines only last 30 years, solar 20, and batteries 10. But most of that wind turbine is steel and copper and aluminium. Most of those solar cells is glass and aluminium. Most of those batteries are metals: lithium, nickel, copper. All of those things are amongst the materials that are recycled more than any other materials on Earth. All of them can be recycled as much as 80 or 90%. So if we were recycling your wind turbines, your solar cells, your batteries every year at the rate of 80%, you'd only need 10 kilograms each of these things. So now we're talking about your current lifestyle needs 6,000 kilograms worth of holes dug every year that goes up into the atmosphere versus 30 kilograms over here. It may not be perfect, but this at least points in a very good direction of how we could close the loop and do a truly circular economy. So I think a lot of these scare campaigns are actually, and I could dig you up and show you the evidence, funded, not surprisingly, by the fossil fuel companies that don't want you to go this way.
Yeah, it's an interesting answer, isn't it? But that is when you start digging and seeing the sort of forensic background of where these sort of reservations and concerns are coming from. It is quite interesting. But that's a very good answer, and hopefully for that person who's watching us, you can go back to your clients with that response. Now, let's talk about some operational.
The book that I'm writing next for America is actually explicitly, it's going to be called Stuffed. It is explicitly teasing out all of these details, because I think rightfully people are concerned that you can make the statement, we could at this point solve climate change and still screw the oceans and fuck up all the environments that we live in. So it's really to say that the problem after the problem, the existential problem after our current existential problem is where does all this stuff come from? And I'm optimistic about it, and that'll be the topic of my next book.
Oh, great stuff. And we'll talk about the big switch later on, because we've got a deal for the viewers here today, a few bucks off your book, which you released back in mid-February, which is fantastic. Again, in your typical larrikin style of authorship, it's something that's a bit different to anything else I've ever read. Let's talk about some more operational stuff. Are there, and this is from Julian, who's tuning in. Julian asks, look, are there any feasible electric boilers for hydronic heating systems, both hydronic underfloor and in-room radiators?
Absolutely. You call them reverse cycle AC here. They're really just a heat pump. You can buy air to water heat pumps that use the heat pump to take the heat out of the air and heat up water, and then you can use that as the water to feed your hydronic system. That is exactly the system that I installed in my new house in San Francisco. I actually use the water as a battery, so I actually have extra tanks for the water. I heat it up when the solar system on the roof is going really well, and then I can pump it through the house later that day through the hydronic system for the heat. It also does the hot water for the showers and the plumbing in the same system. There is a company in Australia that sells a system that's very similar. We made our own in the US, and we're going to be selling systems in the US. But that is now, if you're doing a new build, you know, what would be my advice? I would like every home in Australia to be architect built, because they're, you know, I grew up in one, and I love, have a crush on architects. But if all we could do is have north facing roofs, and the heating, you know, the heating system that we build the house around takes the solar through that heat pump, it stores some of the energy in the water systems, do hydronic heating. Those are the two key features to me of what we should be doing for all new build housing, because you can turn the house into a battery. You use our rooftops as solar generation, and so that'll be not only the cheapest, but it will require the least land elsewhere to be used for renewables if we generate the majority of our energy on our roofs. The other things I'd add to that is an electric kitchen and electric vehicle charging facilities, and you know, that's the first 5 basic things of the modern all-electric home.
Feel free to plug the necessity for architect design homes in your next book. I'm happy to support that. And I know everybody on this call definitely would.
You know, you can horrify me. I do know that in the US, slightly less than 2% of homes are designed by architects, and the rest are designed by
developers,
builders, and then cut and pasted. I think it's worth having a run at the new government with it doesn't matter if the builders build them all, but can we just have architects make sure that the 98% are efficient? Yeah,
that's a brilliant thing. Happy to support that in any way possible. Let's talk about timing. This is a question of timing for you, Saul, and I know you're still getting over COVID, so I'll try not to talk you to death. But Julian wants to know, in terms of timing, when do you calculate when do you want to replace, or how to replace, gas appliances that are still working, but when you're factoring in, you know, the embodied energy to actually create a replacement device, you know, gas boosters or, you know, solar hot water devices and stuff like that? What's your response? When is the best time to do that?
You can't really measure or calculate for any particular machine the embodied energy. It depends how many times the tradie has to drive their truck to the site, for example. It's like, you know, if the tradie has to go to Bunnings 4 times to put your induction stove in, then it's very, very different than if the induction stove just fits in the same hole that the gas was in. So I'd say we're fighting the wrong war if we're trying to do those calculations perfectly.
Yeah. Okay.
The right war, though, just to finish, because I think this is a really important point, is machines that burn fossil fuels that are already in the planet will take us to 1.8 degrees, meaning if every gas stove lives out its natural life, every hot water heater, every car, every coal station, 1.8. So you really want to make sure that anytime anyone is making a purchasing decision around one of these things, that they're helping them get the electric version. For the majority of things that happen to houses, that either happens when you're building it the first time, when you're doing a major renovation or when you're doing a refinancing. Those are the three moments for a household where they will be looking at whether to upgrade the kitchen appliances, upgrade the water heater, upgrade the heating system. And almost certainly every single one of those moments you should take as the opportunity to put in the all electric appliance. And it will always be the right choice, because every year there's more renewables on the grid. So every year that electric thing will be having a lower and lower and lower, and then eventually zero emission profile.
Yep. Great stuff. Thanks. This is a question from Kyra Thomas. She's an incredible architect. She's lived and worked in New York, and so she understands that American journey that you've probably been on as well. She's on the call with us at the present time. She's now based in Sydney. She wants to know about EVs. When's the best time to look at swapping out a car that might be perfectly fine to drive now, but when do you think is the best time to invest in an EV? I know I watched your YouTube video the other day. You're behind the wheel of your Tesla. When's a good time to invest in an electric vehicle?
Not my Tesla, just going to say.
Isn't it yours? Oh, I thought it was yours. Right, okay.
I don't own a Tesla. It was, I did a show for coal miners driving Teslas, Dan Blakely. It's a great show.
Right.
If you want to see me drive like an arsehole through the national park in a Tesla, that's the show for you.
Sounds good.
The answer, Cara, is that if you bought a new Volvo last year and you were to buy a Tesla this year and you were to scrap the Volvo, it's a bad idea. The reality is nearly everyone sells their used car. So because that car will exist whether or not you own it, the answer is always, as soon as possible as you can afford it, to purchase the electric vehicle, because then you're increasing the demand for the electric vehicles. You're setting the market signals for more and more electrics. Another way to say it is, if there isn't an electric car you want to buy this year, try and squeeze one more year out of the shitbox and then get the electric car.
They are pretty pricey, though. I mean, they are out of the reach at this stage. Seem to be out of the reach of the majority of the Australian public.
So I think that's true, but the point at which an electric car will cost the same in a showroom as a petrol vehicle should be about 2025, 2026. That's how fast they're falling. It's about $15,000 more expensive today to buy, for example, the Hyundai Kona electric than the Hyundai not electric. You will save $2,000 a year in that vehicle on petrol by it being electric. And so in 7 years, the electric vehicle pays for itself. So it is actually the right economic choice already in Australia, unless you can't afford the credit to buy that upfront cost. So that's why I'm an advocate for various government programs that can help you buy that thing and then you pay it back as though you're buying the petrol. The other way of saying it is, if anyone you see who's driving a new Range Rover or a new BMW could have bought an electric car, and with this change left over, taken their whole household to zero emissions. So that for the 10% of Australian households that are buying luxury imported vehicles, they're just planet fucking hypocrites, and you should call your clients straight out for it. For the middle 60%, they would probably buy the car on financing, and if they look at whole cost of ownership, it's nearly getting there economically. And then for the lowest income 30, 40, 50% of Australian households, they pretty much always buy used cars. Unless we have government intervention, they're just going to have to wait. And I'm actually an advocate for government intervention to build market capacity and to lower our emissions faster, because it is actually in the economic interest of Australia to do so.
Mm. Okay, thanks for that. Look, Liza Neal has put a comment in the chat here. She's taught, and it's a good thing. Liza's principal architect for Moreton Bay Regional Council, I think. So, and based in Queensland, and of course has a very close link to national and federal government. And she makes a good point. She's talking about a time for a federal government architect. You probably know this all anyway, but in each of our states and territories, we have a government architect who sits at that local level and is responsible for ensuring, and advocating for architects and things like that. But a good point to have a federal government architect. Talking on that, there's a text that's hit my phone in terms, and it just says, please ask Saul, the new Labor government, happier with the proposed...
Can I just say something beautiful? Yep. I 100% agree about time for federal government, federal architect. I once stayed in an Airbnb just north of San Francisco. I can't remember the suburb's name. and it was owned by the first Californian state architect. He was an incredible man. He was obsessed with figuring out how to do better sewage systems and better energy systems. He had a Dutch name. You could still go and visit his house. He's still got a few of his marbles, and he'll actually chat to you, and you can read, he has the entire history of green architecture lining the walls of that Airbnb. And it really brought home to me how important he put all the original solar on the California government buildings, passive solar design for California government buildings. I think absolutely Australia could afford a federal government architect to lead by example like that. We need example building codes to set the standard by which all the builders build to. It is an extraordinarily good idea. As a professional organization, I think you should all, with single-mindedness, make that your goal this year, is to make sure that this federal government is the first one to install a federal government architect. I wish I could remember the name of my friend.
Oh, well, if you remember it, then drop me a line and I'll drop it over to Liza. Look, two more questions, because one, I'm conscious of time for everybody to get back to the office, get back to work after a little bit of a lunch break, and two, your COVID-affected voice. Look, let's go two more questions. Okay, Rand says, look, the circular economy answer that you presented earlier, he said, was spot on. He said, we need that broader understanding of all this stuff, not just carbon. The question that Rand asks, how much does the climate zone affect how easy this is?
It depends on a little bit more than the climate zone. And so the geeky aspect of the question is the heat capacity, the coefficient of performance of the heat pump is determined by the climate zone. Australia really has all mild climate zones, except for a tiny bit of the ACT, New South Wales, and Tasmania, and Victoria, but they're not extreme by American standards. In Tasmania, they got so much cheap hydro that actually they might have an even easier run if they just save a little bit extra hydro for the winter, and they don't. So they're not penalized by being in a more difficult climate zone because they already have so much renewables in the form of hydro. So I think the answer to that question is, we don't need passive house standards in Australia. We just need reasonable standards, and it's pretty easy in every one of our climate zones.
Sounds great. Thanks, Saul. Look, I'm just going to finish off because, again, we've sort of got an hour to spend with you, and I know you're a very, very busy and very popular presenter. You've written The Big Switch, your recent book. You launched that in mid-February. Give us a 30 to 60 second synopsis on, there it is, for those of you seeing that on Saul's screen. Give us a 30 to 60, and keep holding it up, 30 to 60 second synopsis of what that book's about.
It's really prosecuting the case that Australia, because of our natural advantages, our mild climate, our extraordinary renewables, and our reasonably good forms of governance, we have the easiest path of any country to get to zero emissions, and it's almost our obligation to show the rest of the world how to do it. It is also tackles the issue of, the division and the climate wars were fought over what Australia had to lose. So they was very much focused on, we're going to lose our exports, we're going to lose our jobs, we're going to lose this, that, and the other. But that really only addressed the supply side, where we got our energy from: mining, coal, oil, gas. And so it really was trying to reorient the climate conversation in Australia to the demand side, to our buildings, to our cars, to the things that affect everyday Australians' lives, and show us that that's where we have all the things to win. That's where we get better air quality inside our homes, better air quality inside our communities, faster, cleaner cars, better, cleaner kitchens and cooking. And so I think that was the main goal, hoping to actually transform our federal policy on energy to be a little more domestic focused, and to acknowledge that the industry and the export component is really a research and development problem that's still a decade in the making, and wanting us to make our big emission cuts this decade by decarbonizing the demand side where we live.
Perfect. Thank you very much. For those of you, you can see it in the chat, we'll give $3 off that off Saul's book and free shipping to you. So if you click on that link in the chat, that'll get you access to that book, and of course put in that code AIA Australian Institute of Architects, AIA, big switch at the checkout, and that'll get you those $3 off that book. It is well worth a read. If you liked Saul's presentation, if you found it simple yet compelling, that's his book in a nutshell. And in his true Aussie style of speaking and presenting, you'll get the same sort of thing. It's not death by science, but it's just incredibly fascinating to read. So I do recommend it to all of you on this call. That's really it for this lean-in. Saul, you've been great. Thanks so much for spending some time with us. We've really appreciated what you've got to say. You've just been a champion, and thank you so much for this presentation. We, of course, are recording this session. So what we'll do is we'll package it up in the next 24 hours or so, and we'll pop it onto the Institute website and also onto our Institute YouTube channel in case you came in late or anything at all like that. So don't hesitate to look there.
You've got to cut out anything I said about the White House and the administration.
Yeah, you may find yourself forcibly disappeared somewhere. And no, it was great, Saul. It was fantastic. It's always great to have you. And thanks very much for your forthright responses and your honesty. It's really refreshing in this space. And, music to our ears when you talk about, the support of a government architect at a federal level, the critical need for architect design houses on a scale that's much grander than what it currently is, not only in the US, but also very much here in Australia. So thanks very much, team, for all of you for tuning in. It's been great. Of course, I'm Michael Linke here at the Institute of Architects, as always, doing these lean-ins, and it's always been my pleasure to bring this to you. So thanks very much for tuning in. Have a great rest of the day, and chat to you all very, very soon. See you at a future lean-in. And thank you, Saul, and to our sponsor, Momentum Energy, who brought Saul to us. Momentum, of course, have got a fantastic offer coming soon to all of our institute members. They're one of Australia's greenest energy companies with a huge focus on renewables, and that's the focus that we're going to in this organisation. So watch this space. But anyway, have a great day, everybody, and see you all very soon. And thank you again, Saul. Great to spend time with you, mate.
Cheers, everyone. Bye.
All right, see you later. Bye-bye.